So in this video, I will present my final project for ESPM 50AC, and the topic of my presentation will be the discrimination behind Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. The Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico in September 2017. According to NOAA, it is a Category 4 storm that put 3.4 million residents into a desperate humanitarian crisis. People in the town lost access to electricity, clean drinking water, food, and many other resources. If we zoom into the picture here, we can get a sense of the severe destruction that the hurricane brought to local residents. Streets are flooded by water, and houses are mostly damaged. Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States that located on the northeast Caribbean Sea. Most of the people there lived in poverty. In fact, it is one of the areas with the highest poverty rates. The unemployment rate on the island was more than double the national level. Even before the hurricane hit, a large population in Puerto Rico was categorized as low-income people, with a median annual income of about $20,000 compared to the $57,000 in the rest of the United States. We could see that Puerto Rico was already under an economic crisis before the destruction of the Hurricane Maria, and the disaster certainly exacerbated the poor situation on the island. The Hurricane Maria had an estimated $94 billion cost. It ranks the third costliest climate disasters in the United States, which is right after Hurricane Harvey. Other than the significant damage the hurricane has caused, a lot of people lost their lives due to this disaster. However, the death toll of Hurricane Maria has long been disputed. While the official figure is 64, many local residents argue that the actual deaths are far more than that. The mayor of the capital, San Juan, accused the U.S. government of deliberately downplaying the impact of the storm. 1 year after the storm, the number was finally revised to 2,975. Although it is still below the 4,600 deaths that many experts have estimated, it is now at least 50 times higher than the original figure. The situation in Puerto Rico after the hurricane was terrible. The survivors were left disregarded by the US government for weeks, and people on the island became increasingly frustrated with the inadequate support that the Trump administration provided for them. 8 members of the Congress asked for a temporary waiver of the Jones Act, which is a law that permits solely American ships to carry goods and passengers between American ports, since they believe that it can help to expand access to food, medicine, clothing, and all the other necessities needed by the Puerto Ricans. Although Trump eventually waived this act, he did it until 8 days after the storm, and he seemingly did so only in response to the public outcry. It also took 8 days for the U.S. Department of Defense to deploy a 3-star general to the island to oversee relief efforts, which was likely the result of a delay in Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is also called the FEMA, or White House approval. Given what Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis said, we had people ready to go as fast as they were asked for by the FEMA. 13 days after Maria hit, Trump finally showed up on the island for a brief visit of just 5 hours. He taunted, "We've spent a lot of money on Puerto Rico." Days earlier, he even scolded the island's residents, saying that they want everything to be done for them. In addition, Trump has threatened to cut off federal aid for Puerto Rico when their residents need it the most. At around the same time, there are 2 other hurricanes hit the mainland of the United States: the Hurricane Harvey in Texas and Hurricane Irma in Florida. Compared with the government's response to the other 2 hurricanes, we can see Puerto Ricans were clearly underserved. According to CBS News, compared with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, federal response was way much faster and more generous across measures of money and staffing to Hurricanes Harvey and Irma in Texas and Florida. This differential treatment will only make sense if Hurricane Maria caused less damage than the other two hurricanes. But the fact is that Hurricane Maria was much more intense. Although all three of these hurricanes are considered Category 4, Maria is a high-end Category 4, or just below the threshold of a Category 5 storm. So, in terms of the damage and intensity of the storm, Maria is definitely more destructive than the other two. But if we look at the government's response to Hurricane Maria, key emergency supplies for Puerto Rico were already in short supply before Maria hit, and the government's immediate assistance after the disaster, including providing supplies for food, water, and tarps, were incredibly low comparing to those provided to survivors of Hurricane Irma and Harvey. If we take a close look at the graph, 9 days after the hurricane hit, survivors from Irma and Harvey already received adequate aid to help them to recover. 5.1 million meals, 4.5 million liters of water, 20,000 tarps were delivered to Texas. 10.9 million meals, 7 million liters of clean water, and 98,000 tarps were delivered to Florida. But if we look at the supplies provided to Puerto Rico, only 1.6 million meals, 2.8 million liters of water, and only 5,000 tarps were delivered to them. Nearly $100 million was awarded to individuals and families in Texas and Florida. Comparing to the recovery aid that the mainland residents received, Maria survivors only had a total federal aid of slightly over $6 million. From such a disproportionately distribution of federal staffing, we can see that Puerto Ricans were significantly in short of both resources and funds. And the main cause behind this scenario is race and ethnicity. So, in this slide, I'm going to talk about a brief history of Puerto Rico and how local residents felt about the government's response after the hurricane. So, during the Spanish American War in 1898, the U.S. gained control over Puerto Rico. After more than a century under the rule of the U.S., Puerto Rico is still considered as a foreign land. The main reason behind this is clear. Puerto Ricans are still perceived as ethnically different than citizens in the mainland. Polls taken in the aftermath of the Hurricane Maria indicated that barely 50% of the population grasped that Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States, and that its people are U.S. citizens, with full freedom of travel to the mainland. Most of the Puerto Ricans believe that they did not receive adequate support from the government, and they have grown to be skeptical about their relationships with U.S. after the hurricane. Efrain Molina, a senior computer network engineer at the Hospital of Special Surgery in New York, said, "Are we receiving equal government resources for aid in crises? No. For infrastructure repair? No." She even describes the treatment that the Puerto Ricans received from the government gave her a feeling that they are second-class citizens. There are many other factors that led to the local residents to feel this way. 2 years after Maria, the mayor of Yabucoa, Rafael Cirillo Reitz, sorry if I pronounced his name wrong, said that we are in the same situation as we were in the days after the hurricane. The nurses and doctors on the islands and other medical workers are still treating gunshot wounds in hallways and kidney failure in a trailer. We can see that the situation did not improve even after 2 years of the hurricane. The recovery efforts provided to Puerto Rico, compared with those offered to Texas and Florida, were clearly not enough. Much of the assistance offered to Puerto Ricans were actually from local nonprofits instead of the government. According to FEMA, there are 190 out of 9,000 requested long-term funded recovery projects in progress for Puerto Rico. And on the Virgin Islands, there are approximately 218 out of more than 1,500 requested projects that received funding. If we compare all the assistance provided to Puerto Ricans with the fundings given to the mainland regions, we can see a stark difference in treatment. About 3,700 large and small permanent work projects were funded by the government in Texas 2 years after Hurricane Harvey, and more than 3,700 such projects had been funded over the time in Florida. Angel Perez, a local resident on the island, said that the government support had always been lacking after the Hurricane Maria. As a community social worker, I can tell you that Puerto Rico's recovery, if it can be called that, didn't come thanks to the government. It came from all the nonprofit associations. It came from the neighbors themselves. It came from foundations. It came from the hands of other people who supported the families that suffered the most. There are many nonprofit organizations help to gather fundings and supplies for survivors in Puerto Rico. For example, the Unidos by the Hispanic Federation is a group of elected officials in New York and Puerto Rico that help to gather relief funds for Puerto Ricans. Also, the government of Dominica collected funds to provide daily necessities for survivors in Puerto Rico. The collected donations were processed through Just Giving, which would then be delivered directly to the residents on the island. Recently, Trump decided to distribute fundings to Puerto Rico. Well, let us review the stats again. According to NBC News, Hurricane Maria alone inflicted an estimated $90 billion in damage, for which Congress allocated only $42.5 billion in disaster relief. The Trump administration only allocated a $26 billion of that money. Much of it has yet to be dispersed. On September 18, 2020, a few months ago, Trump said, I have to say in a very nice way, very respectful way, I'm the best thing that ever happened to Puerto Rico. But over the last 3 years, he constantly declined disaster fundings for Puerto Ricans. Even worse, according to Miles Taylor, a former Department of Homeland Security Chief of Staff, Trump recently asked if the US could swap Greenland for Puerto Rico because, in Trump's words, Puerto Rico was dirty and people were poor. The only reason that Trump made the claim that he's the best thing that ever happened to Puerto Rico is because he recently promised to grant nearly $13 billion of disaster funding for electrical grid and educational infrastructure repairs, although the reconstruction was late for 3 years. Many might be curious, why did Trump suddenly become so friendly to Puerto Rico and even release federal funding for them? Because election is happening soon, and Trump really needs the votes from Latinos in Florida. According from the stats in NBC News, the Central Florida has one of the largest concentrations of Boricuas from islands on the mainland, around 50,000 of whom are among almost 200,000 people who left the islands after Maria, and then Washington's neglect tore their lives apart. Currently, Biden had a strong advantage over Trump among 1 billion Puerto Ricans in Florida. And in order to regain the support, Trump needs to befriend Puerto Ricans to make up for his neglect of the people there after Hurricane Maria. And here you can see is a meme of Trump, and here he said, by the way, I'm the best thing that ever happened to Puerto Rico. And then below there's an image that says, you unlocked the clown outfit. And that's my project. Thank you very much for watching my presentation.